Great. We are, we're going to be, first, let me introduce myself. My name is Jonathan Schwab. I'm one of the pediatricians and the medical director at Northampton Area Pediatrics. And today, my job is to just give you an outline of how today's workshop will go and to introduce we're honored to have our guest here, Desiree DeWitt. Before I do that, I'd like to just tell people a little bit about the workshops that we have here at Northampton Area Pediatrics. We've been doing this for probably about a decade now. And we often find that it's difficult for us as pediatricians to get to everything that is important in a child's health in the visits that we currently have. And there are so many different important medical issues that come up that I think parents could benefit from getting more information. And so the idea is to just expand upon the kinds of things that we would like to talk to parents about and to give them some information about those things that are so important that require more time. And today's topic is certainly one of those that's very confusing for most of us, myself included. Today, we're going to talk about special needs education in the public schools and talk about all the different things that I never learned in medical school. I never knew what a 504 IEP and all the things that Desiree is going to help us with today. So it's very confusing. So I hope that you will be able to understand a little bit more about this confusing process. And we also want this to be a very relaxed environment. We are recording it because many people expressed the interest in hearing what we have to say today, but is not able to attend. So I hope that's okay with people that we are recording this. So how are we doing this today? After Ms. Lewitt starts to, during her presentation, there will be times that she will stop and we can feel free, please, to answer and ask any questions and we'll try our best to answer them. I'll ask that you use the chat function for that. If you're having trouble writing that down in a chat function, then just let me know and we certainly can unmute you and you can ask it verbally. There's not a huge group today, so that should not be a problem at all. We want to make sure that what you're interested in and your needs are met today. So I will go on and start by introducing our guest today and our speaker. Desiree Lewitt is a licensed social worker, and she is also an educational consultant. And she's done this in the past because she has both personal and professional experience in helping parents and children who have special needs. She also is one of our main members of our behavioral health team here at NAP. At NAP, you may already know that we have in-house behavioral health specialists who can help our patients with short-term problem-focused therapy. And it's been an incredibly vital part of our program. And it's revolutionized actually how we've been able to help our patients who have mental health issues and problems. So without anything else, I would like to say thank you so much for joining us, Desiree. I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Schwab. Hello, everyone. It's nice to be here this evening to share an overview of some special education law, Individual Disability Education Act, basic rights, a little history, a little bit on activism, some basic rights and advocacy tips and tricks. I probably have enough information to do a 3-part series. So today I'm gonna kind of do an overview, but really also want to welcome any questions or anything, insights or clarifications or anything like that that you're hoping for throughout the workshop. So here's a little overview here, which will be going into some of the details of special education law, including federal and state law and some of the differences and how that applies when you're navigating the IEP or 504 process for your child or teen or young adult, and then a little on history and activism, namely ableism. a little bit, probably more on basic rights, and then more in advocacy tips and tricks for parents, and then also a list of resources and information. This is an endless topic. You could learn so much about this and devote your whole life to it if you wanted to, but for all intents and purposes, just to be an assistance, this is what we'll do for today. So just wanted to give a little background about, as Dr. Schwab was saying, I am both I have two laptops going here, and okay, there we go. So I am both a parent and a professional. I like to say that I'm a parent first. So I have a son who is now 21 years old, and he was born with Down syndrome, and I had him very young, so it was a quite a experience. I wasn't expecting to have a son navigating learning differences or neurodiversity or intellectual disability like my son has and continues to do. So at a very young age, I was having to learn a lot of really challenging, complicated information while trying to parent a high needs little guy. So part of it too, as I'm sharing today, is so just a lot of this is from personal experience, but also as I evolved and became a parent advocate, and then eventually an ed consultant and a social worker. And so I've worked in many realms in the behavioral health realm, but one of my sort of induction into all of this was through special education advocacy, and then helping and supporting parents, and working with schools and in collaboration and supporting and help maintain good relations between parents and schools in support of helping their kids and teens access their learning with the guidelines of the law. So let's see here. I'm gonna let's see. So then the next slide here is just goes into a little bit of history. I won't go into too much detail, but on I think it's just important to highlight, that special education law was not always something that we had, that it started in, it's only because of parents that special education law exists at all. And it's only because of parents that laws have changed to include all students within the realm of learning differences and physical differences, or perceived differences, as I like to say, to be included in accessing their learning in public school settings. Prior to 1973, parents were pressured to send, it was really quite horrible and traumatic and abusive and violent, pressured to send their children to institutions, and parents were given no choice, as children with any kind of perceived difference were not permitted access to the building, right? Like literally no ramps, say if you were a wheelchair user, let alone access to their learning, as in no access to full inclusion with their peers, and students were segregated. So in 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education is when the Supreme Court established that all children be guaranteed equal educational opportunity, meaning that children would not be segregated due to race, ability, religion, etc., so that all children will have equal access to all educational opportunities that are funded by the government for the public schools. Of course, we still have a long way to go in this endeavor, but these are things in it, and everything started with the Brown versus Board of Education, and then in 1973, legislation was introduced, and then we had the 504 plan, or 504, and then in 1975, Public Law 94142 was put in place, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So there are some differences there, but they're kind of part of one of the same. Then in 2004, IDEA was updated. There's a great, this is on the list, but a wonderful resource called Rights Law, and they have a lot of information. It's just like Rights Law website, and like everything you'd ever want to know about anything is on there, and it's a great resource. So a little more on disability rights and activism, which I feel like I already spoke to, but it exists thanks to the great work of parents and individuals with disabilities and their allies. And it's thanks to legacy of disability rights activism that inclusion exists at all, or at least the idea of it. I say, because yes, there is access, but the pendulum is really swinging backwards, and especially in light of COVID. And I don't mean just at schools, but just in many arenas of access. So I go into ableism a bit and just defining what is ableism, which is a term I mentioned earlier. And like racism and sexism, ableism classifies entire groups of people as quote unquote less than, and includes harmful stereotypes, misconceptions, and generalizations of people with disabilities within that. So examples of ableism would be, what does it look like? So a lot of times it's ableism can take many forms. So it could be lack of compliance with disability rights laws like ADA, like not having ramps into a building for, as a most simple example, or segregating students with disabilities in separate schools, using restraint or seclusion as a means of controlling students with disabilities. The list goes on and on. But I just wanted to touch on that. And also just paying attention to microaggressions of ableism, like everyday verbal expressions that communicate, a negative slight or insult in relation to someone's gender identity, race, sex, disability, etc. Some examples would be statements like, that's so lame, or you are so retarded, or that guy is crazy, or acting so bipolar, or did you take your meds today? Like those are all examples of ableism, which perpetuate systems of oppression that people internalize. And it doesn't feel very good. It's very othering. And things we could do to recognize and avert ableism would be believe people when they disclose a disability, or similarly don't accuse someone of faking their disability, and listening to people when they request an accommodation. So I'm just giving this as a little bit of an overview and background, just to kind of, as we kind of, get closer to talking about the nuts and bolts, and just to give context more so. So one of the most important things to do to push back against ableism is to make sure people with disabilities and their parents or guardians, especially people with disabilities, are at the table where decisions are being made. So there's more on history and legacy. And then I was just wanting to know, before I go into the next portion of the workshop goals, including understanding your rights under special education law and understanding special education procedures and so on, what are you hoping to come away with from this workshop today? And if you wouldn't mind, please adding that in the chat.
Desiree, do you want to continue on your next slide, and then I'll give people a few minutes to write what they'd like to, and see, and then I can get back to you on that.
Yeah, great idea. Thank you. So the workshop goals, so understand your rights. So for today, our workshop goals are going to be to understand your rights under special education law, 2, understand special education procedures, and 3, understand the process so you can better participate in the team process in terms of collaboration with the school, in the service of better supporting your child or teen or young adult. I really want to emphasize on the collaboration piece, because, it's when you're working, if a kid or a teen in 504 IEP, things can get contentious. And a lot of this work is in the service of just trying to support parents and educators as well to work more collaboratively, because it's, when if things go south, or, there's a lot of contention or challenge, it's really challenging. You really want to try to work with your school district. and there's not, on both sides, and the school districts have a lot of work they need to do too, everyone, both sides, but in each community it varies, I realize. So and then a little,
a couple of people have written things that I think are in your talk, but just so that you can keep that in your mind, to emphasize that. I'll just read them. What is the difference between an IEP and a 504? Also, what else can be done to understand learning differences? I assume that might mean maybe testing. Another is understanding my rights around IEPs to see if my child is actually benefiting from it. Also the process in which the team meeting and how I really know that the goals are being met. Seeing your slides, I know you're going to go through that as well, I think. Hoping to navigate securing an IEP for social emotional needs when academics are strong, especially if there's been some resistance from the school. So those are the kinds of things I think people are looking for. It looks like kind of some concrete ideas on what the process is, how to get through that process and make it best for their children.
Okay, great. Thank you. So yes, I think most of that will be covered. And then also please feel free to chime in with questions as we go along. So the basic rights outline, we're going to try to cover today as much as possible with the time we have is the purpose of the law, when and how to make a referral, evaluations, team meeting process, standards for determining special education eligibility, and then services, placement determination, what to do if the team decides your student, or your child is not eligible, what happens after the close of the meeting, parents' response options to an IEP, and procedural due process rights for resolving disputes, etc. This one goes into what are their special education laws. The first one, as I mentioned before, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, just sort of stating it here at numbers and regulations. A lot of this stuff you could look up, and a lot of what I'm drawing from is actually very directly from the law. I'm not making, making this stuff up or extrapolating, kind of really following a lot of the guidelines in both federal and Massachusetts law, with the websites I could send to you. In Massachusetts state law, important to note, state law trumps federal law. So a lot of times there'll be different regulations between federal law and Massachusetts law. And if there is a difference, then the state law trumps or federal law, which is just important to know. And again, the federal law protects students from disability discrimination. And Section 504 protects any student with a disability from discrimination based on disability. And now the question someone had, what is the difference between 504 and an IEP? And this is a really complex answer, but I found this video because I feel like it helps to kind of distill this a bit. So I'm going to play, and if there's any issue with audit, if it's not audible or something, if someone could just write in the chat.
There are many differences between an IEP and a 504 plan.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I think was everyone able to hear that? I think.
Yes.
Okay, great.
First and most fundamental is they're governed by different laws. An IEP is governed by a special education law. 504 is governed under a civil rights law. And that makes a difference in what kinds of services and how an IEP plan and 504 plan come together. To qualify for an IEP, you have to have one of 13 specified conditions or disabilities that are written in the law. For example, specific learning disability, which would be something like dyslexia, would be a condition that a child would qualify for an IEP under. Having one of those 13 identified disabilities isn't enough to make sure your child gets an IEP. Whatever is going on with your child, whatever that disability is, also has to affect his performance in the classroom. And that's really important to know, because sometimes parents think that just having a disability qualifies for an IEP, but you also need to make sure that it's making a difference. It has what's called educational impact, adverse impact in the classroom for how your child's learning. For a 504 plan, a child needs to have a disability that is getting in the way of his learning in the general education classroom. The difference isn't that he needs specialized instruction, it's that he needs some changes to get benefit from his education the same way as other kids in that classroom. And so kids who have ADHD often have 504 plans, and what happens is just changes are made to the environment, and those changes are called accommodations. And those changes are made in the general education classroom and don't require specialized instruction. So for example, a child with ADHD may need extra time to work on a test or to get his homework done. So some people are concerned that a 504 plan isn't as good as an IEP. And the truth of the matter is that a 504 plan or an IEP can meet your child's needs. It just depends on how well it's put together. A well-written, well implemented plan that everybody knows what's going to be happening and in place and is working on it can be very helpful for a child who doesn't need that specialized instruction. As long as there's a lot of follow through and everybody's checking in to make sure it's working well, a 504 plan can be very helpful for kids in the classroom.
Key takeaways. An IEP is governed by a special education law. A 504 plan is governed by a civil rights law. A 504 plan covers kids with disabilities who don't require specialized instruction.
Okay, and so there, and I'm going to go into this a bit more in more detail, and also some resources that emphasize those differences more. But the specialized instruction piece is important. So it's like there are other details too that I'll go into later. But this, like basically having a 504 is not having specialized instruction, because having specialized instruction is in effect special education, whereas having a 504 is having more of accommodation to the general education curriculum. And again, there's more details in the process and how to access supports and so on. So in here, it's what is the purpose of the IDEA? And it's basically, as it says here, is to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free, appropriate, and public education. So free, right, at no cost to the family or the parents, appropriate, designed specifically to the, tailored to the learning style of the child or teen, and then public. So public's important, right? Because none of these things apply in private schools. So great inequity there in my view, and so on. But anyway, so it goes on to say so that emphasizes that special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for, with emphasis here, further education, employment, and independent living, and to ensure that the rights of children with disabilities and parents of such children are protected. So there's the procedural safeguard component, and then also preparing, one for a student, for being able to attain employment of some sort of their desire and so on, as they get, especially after 22 when their entitlement ends, or for further education, independent living. And that will go into more detail too, like transition services, and that's related to an IEP versus a 504. So this, I already covered that. So maybe this is a little too soon because we just watched the video. So maybe I'll come back to that. Oh, wait, this is starting without my meaning to do that. So this is just another video that just goes into the basic principles of an IDEA. So here, individualized education programs and 504 plans can offer formal help for K-12 students who are struggling in school, and they're similar in some ways, but very different, as was outlined in that video. And then I'm just going to pause here for any questions.
Feel free to write more questions as we go along. Right now, we had a question about advocates, but I know that you're getting to that later as well. So I'll let you continue then.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can talk about special education advocates later, but also give a link to, I think it's the Valley ADHD group website has a list of advocates on there if you're looking for actual recommendations. And then also the Federation for Children with Special Needs, fcsn.org, you can contact them and they can also help you find advocates as well. Okay, so now I'm going to go into, but great question, thank you. Important timelines. And so at the beginning here, so very, so how it works, let's do get respectfully. Okay, so once a parent or an educator or other professional has identified that a child might be navigating a disability, then a referral should be placed to the school. So it doesn't have to be a parent who does it or a guardian, but it could be an educator, other professional, like Dr. Schwab, to go, okay, I think this kiddo might benefit from special education eligibility determination evaluation because he's suspecting some needing support in accessing their learning or something. So an initial referral is placed, And then the school has 5 school days. And I want to also place emphasis on the difference between school days and calendar days, because that's it comes up a lot in this process. So you place the referrals placed, and usually you want to that would be to the principal or like the special education liaison through the school or something to that effect. I'm going to skip ahead here because this starts to break down. But as you can see, consent 30 days, evaluations, and the school must start evaluations 30 days after consent. So, and then eligibility, the school has 45 school days from when the consent is given initially to complete the evaluation and the eligibility determination process, and 45 school days meaning after consent. So the parents or guardians should have a, in this case, an eligibility determination process should be completed from 45 days, at which point the referral was initially placed. And then if that does not happen, then the school is technically out of compliance. And so that's another conversation. Which I can
Desiree, can I interrupt for a second? Because somebody just asked this question. I wasn't sure what consent means.
Okay.
What do you mean by consent?
Consent, sorry. So the referral's placed and that the parent gives consent for the assessment or for the process.
So if the parent is asking, often I think it is the parent who's asking.
It is, yeah.
Then that's consent already.
Yes.
And let me ask this, because I've never thought about this. I've always told parents they have to actually write. How do they notify the principal or the teacher? How do they actually say, I would like to have my child, I have concerns, I'd like to have my child evaluated? Can they do it verbally, or does it have to be written?
Writing, always in writing, because it's like documentation. Because if you do it verbally, then you don't have any documentation to prove, hey, I told you or requested on, September 1st, and here's this email to prove it that I requested this. Does that make sense?
Yep. Thank you.
Okay. And so, so this is here, when and how to make, so to expand on when and how to make the referral. And a referral can be made at any time that the parent or guardian or someone else might have concerns about as to whether a student is accessing their learning. And then, so yes, submit the request in writing as per your query there, Dr. Schwab, to the student's school principal or the director of special education, often at the school. I think it's the student services office, the SSO. And after the referral is made, the school will give parents the consent form. So I think that's like the N1 form. And then parents give their written permission through that particular form to perform. So they're giving the school consent to perform an evaluation. And within that form, there's often, it outlines specifically what is, they're looking at. Let's see here, just jumping ahead here. So that's the evaluation consent form. And so I have a copy of it here. So this is the evaluation consent form. And so it's just a one-page sheet here. And then often it will be outlined, the details, assessments in all areas, suspected disability, et cetera. And then the school will complete that and the parents can have a look and see if they accept the proposal, et cetera. And then once that happens, say there's the evaluation consent form, the school sends the eval consent form to the parent for signature. So they're within 5 school days of receiving the referral. So the school has to send you that form within 5 school days of receiving the referral, whether that was you who placed the referral or someone else. The school evaluates students within 30 school days of receiving the parent signed consent form as part of that timeline I had showed you before. Oops. Let me see if there's anything. And again, submit the request in writing. Email is best. Email is always best. All communication you have with the district regarding anything should always be over email because then it's documented. this one is just showing you where to look for the evaluation consent form, the link, in case that's something you would like to do. It's good to be good to have as a resource. And then this goes a little more into detail about referral and evaluation. And then let's see, it talks about sending notice and then the consent. And here, this is actually directly from the website from with the law, which is, again, there's the link. And I just think that's important to note because everything you ever wanted to know about this process is on that website and it's outlined. And if you ever have an issue, I always encourage people to just cite the law. That's often helpful. If there's ever a question, just doing your own advocacy work yourself. This goes in a little, again, more detail about the school district shall provide the student's parents with an opportunity to consult with the SPED administrator or his or her designee to discuss the reasons for the referral. So let's say the referral is placed and you just want to know why. Let's say you didn't place the referral and someone else. You have open access to all the information and you can request, to talk and confer and get more information from whoever you would like throughout this process. And then talks about which assessments will be performed, and an assessment in all areas related to the suspected disability and an educational assessment by a representative of the school district will include. These, not always, but it might include a comprehensive health assessment, a psychological or a neuropsychological assessment, or a home assessment. Schools can, oftentimes people try to get neuropsychs like from other places, but you can have this, you can request it through the school in this process. And then if they don't have someone on staff who can provide that, they can outsource and pay for, like I know around here, oftentimes people will pay, like a school will hire someone from James and Levine Associates to get a neuropsych. And the home assessment is helpful too, because if, if you want to have a home assessment, say there's behavioral concerns at school, you could have a board certified behavior analyst or someone like that, like come and do an assessment at home to help with any behavioral stuff at home that, lots of people think everything has to be so separated, but there can be that assistance and they give some consultation and guidance. They won't give you a ton of hands-on support necessarily, but just at least some ideas. And then also including in this process, the consideration for students with limited English proficiency, as well as protections so that students are not misclassified as, navigating learning differences when in fact they're, navigating English is a second language that they've learned. So the district must assess the students' proficiency in English and their native language proficiency in reading, writing, speaking, understanding, etc. And so there's that consideration there. Are there any questions? I saw some in the chat, just wondering.
Yeah, so some of the questions are I think you're going to get to, but I want to keep that in your mind. I think people are asking about specific accommodations for specific learning or medical diagnoses such as ADHD and anxiety and the advocate. So I suspect you're good. That's again on the what is involved with a 504 IEP, what's actually in it, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if you want to address that now or probably, or you're going to get to that.
I'll get to that, but also just to say too, that a lot of those decisions will be made based on the assessments and the evaluations that are completed by the evaluators, like whether it's a psychological assessment or usually a psychological assessment, tailored, and that's often a neuropsych or a psych eval are really the best ways to help inform the content of the IEP and or 504 plan and what based on the recommendations from those evaluations. Those are sort of like the key to the kingdom, and they're often very hard to get, as we know, because there's often long wait lists to access. But I encourage everyone to hang in there. But also to other things that will inform the content of an IEP is if, in addition to a psych eval or a neuropsych eval, you're also getting an occupational therapy from the school, speech therapy eval. And in this eligibility determination process, within those 45 days, it's the district's job to complete all of these evaluations and assessments. So, and then to provide their findings, which will inform a proposed IEP that, or 504 plan, you know, to determine what is the student eligible for. And that's really what, and there are, so I'll go more into like the kind of general categories that are in a IEP or 504, but in terms of the actual content and the actual accommodation that your student or child or teen would need, is that would be specific and tailored to their needs. And the school has to, you know, provide that. Say, give you an example, let's say, I don't know, your kiddo needed, this is kind of more generic, but speech therapy. And for some reason they didn't have a speech therapist on staff, they'd have to hire a speech therapist outside the school to provide that service. So I'm gonna continue here. And then, so what happens after the evaluation? So then the evaluator shall summarize in written report procedures used, results, diagnostic impression, student needs, and recommendations to include explicit means of meeting needs. And I think that's what I was just talking about. So it'll be very tailored and specific for your kid. This is what happens after the evaluation, and that's, if requested in writing, a parent can obtain a copy of the evaluation report within at least 2 calendar days before the team meeting, which I always recommend people do, because a lot of times you get to the actual meeting and they're so stressful. And, you know, for parents, you know, you get there, you can't really think, you go offline, there's a lot of stress and anxiety. And then you get this document, you're supposed to like read through it while you're at the meeting, or you get a pile of assessments, and it's just like, it's too much to take in. So I highly recommend that people, that parents, you know, you email right to the school 2 calendar days before the meeting and request a copy of the evaluation report, and whatever types that would be. If they had an OT, speech, psych, neuropsych, education, eval, and so on and so forth, the school should give that. They have to give that to you if you request it. Who's at the meeting? So this is basically, so of course, parent or guardian, school district representative, the student, if they're over 14, general education teacher, special education teacher, related service providers, OT, occupational therapist, speech therapist, assistive technology folks, if they're involved, individual to interpret evaluations, and that would be each professional. So like I say, if there was a psych eval, the psychologist would have to be there to interpret the findings or to disseminate the findings. Same with OT and speech. And also there need to be interpreter services for the family if they're, you know, speak Spanish, say, and there's no one there who speaks Spanish, there needs to be an interpreter. The school has to provide for that. Also there, and then I said others with additional information, but also I tell parents too, this is something I used to do when there were in-person meetings. There were times where maybe things felt especially stressful and more contentious, and I would just invite friends to the meeting. You can invite whoever you want to the meeting, basically. If you have a friend or a family member or anyone, and as many people as you want, there's no limit, just to kind of be there as a support to you, just maybe have someone come and take notes for you, something to that effect. Historically, it varies from district to district, but sometimes people would want to record the meetings. And that would often get very contentious, where school districts would kind of design their own policy saying you can't do that. But if that's something that you need, because let's say you go to the meeting, but like your partner can't go to the meeting, or, you know, your son, whatever, mother, father, son, can't attend, and you're like, hey, they can't go. Or if there's something like that, you can request to record it. And then if the school district is like, what are you talking about there? You could ask for them to show you a policy that says legally you can't do that within their district. And then let's see here. The
We have a
other thing,
question, Desiree,
yeah,
about the meeting itself. The question is, who determines the length of these meetings?
So on average, the meetings are about an hour long, but if you want the meeting to be longer, and I've done this myself where I knew, wow, this is my son's 3-year eval, I'm going to request that we have 2 hours because this is going to take a lot of time. So you can request that it's longer. So the next slide here is I put an emphasis on teamwork. As I spoke before, meetings can become very adversarial in nature, and important that all team players, including parents, educators, and all team members, focus on collaboration. Like really focusing. Sometimes I would bring a picture of my son and just put it in the center of the table, so people remember like what this is about and who this is for. And you will most likely be working with the same team throughout the course of your, child or teen's life. Or throughout the child, of their education. It might seem like their whole life, but the life of their education. And it's important to maintain good boundaries for yourself, and also to assert needs, make requests while maintaining respectful relationships and so on. And that goes both ways, for parents and for educators.
Desiree, we have another question about the meeting, just going back. Can we audio or video record the meeting legally? Is that legal?
So if your school district has a very specific policy that says that you cannot do that, then my understanding is that you can record it. If the school district says, no, you cannot record it, then ask them to show you a policy, within their district that that says that you cannot do that. But legally, you should be able to do that.
And then again, on the meeting, there's a question about team meetings. How often are they adversarial, or are they often adversarial because parents generally want more services and schools want to give less? How often does that happen?
I think it happens enough that there's so many supports and services out there for parents, like training institutes, that it's such a common phenomena. It happens a lot. And districts, and I've dealt with personally and professionally, at least in this area, every district. And I could tell you about, there's a lot of inequity going on. But I think a lot of it has to do with it can become adversarial when sometimes I think people just don't have accurate information. And that I think that, and that goes on both sides. That's why I think going back to the law over and over again, and that's a way. And if you cite the law and if it becomes adversarial, there are, and if the school's really giving you a lot of pushback or something, there's other things you could do. So I could talk about that later, but it is a very common issue, unfortunately. And there's a lot of different reasons that contribute to that. So I think it's a great question, but I could go on about that for a while, but I don't know if that helps. So any other questions?
There are some, but about, again, I think you're going to get to that, so I'll let you
continue. Okay. So the next one is who may be excused from the meeting. So a lot of times, let's see here. There's a meeting and it's scheduled, and so all members of the team must participate in the scheduled meeting unless the parent or guardian agrees by writing their excusal. So you should be notified in advance. Let's say if you're having an IEP meeting or a 504 and the speech therapist can't come or something, you should be notified, because then you have the option to say, you know what, I really need the speech therapist at that meeting, and if they can't come in 2 days, then I want to reschedule. On the same note, if team participants' expertise is required by the parent and the parent has agreed to excuse them, the team member must still provide written input to the parent and the school before the team meeting. So that's the other side of it too. So if the parent is saying, okay, it's fine, they can't come, but they have to provide written input. And then another important thing is if you show up to a meeting and are notified at the time of the meeting that a teammate, once the meeting starts, a member is unable to attend, then you have the right to then cancel and reschedule the meeting until the team member can be there to participate. Or you can, if you want, if you find that out last minute, that's happened to me. And then you can go, okay, well, if they can't come today, then I want to reconvene the team in 2 weeks so that everyone's here, or something to that effect. Any
I
questions?
have a question. At the high school level, should every teacher be there?
It depends on, so if the student has an IEP and, for example, and like that circle diagram I had up before, all those players should be there. Not, I know there's like the English teacher, and I think the teachers who maybe, if there's accommodations in every single class, like if a student has an IEP and they're getting, and that relates to everything, then yeah, all the teachers should be there. With a 504 plan, I think that would be different. So, but in general, yeah, pretty much all the teachers would need to be there. And then here is the initial tasks of the team. So within 45 school days of receipt of parents' written consent, the school will convene a team meeting, review evaluation results, and determine eligibility for special education services. So remember, that's 45 school days, not to be confused with calendar days. That took me a long time. This is highlighting, first of all, this is a wonderful resource that I think everyone should have. If you look this up, if you don't have it or access to it already, and it's called the Writing Guide for the IEP. And I have it on the resource list, a link to it to get it as a PDF. But it's a wonderful guide for parents, and it's designed to enhance the existing directions on the IEP form with additional instruction, and explains the whole process really well. Like here, you'll see, it kind of breaks down, like if does the student have one or more of the following types of disabilities, et cetera. And it says no, then it goes that way. Yes, then it goes down that way, and it breaks it all down. So I just recommend that as a good resource. Hang on, I just want to. So yeah, so it's a flow chart for parents, and that's on the resource page. And then let's see here. I just like to highlight statutes so you have a reference point. You can look it up yourself if you need to cite it. But this is directly from the law, and it's just in the regulations under section 300.8, child with a disability, and it highlights a list of various qualifying diagnoses that would qualify a student for an IEP especially. So here's a list of qualifying disabilities: an intellectual disability, hearing impairment, including deafness, speech or language impairment, visual impairment, serious emotional disturbance referred to in this part as emotional disturbance. That's their languaging. I'm not in love with that languaging, but I would just say kiddos maybe navigating some mental health related issues from post-traumatic stress, for example, would qualify for services if their mental health diagnosis, for example, was interfering with their ability to access their learning, and if they needed accommodation around that. An orthopedic impairment, autism, traumatic brain injury, another health impairment, specific learning disability, deaf, blindness, or multiple disabilities, and so on. And also we talk about effective progress, and that's really important. But before I go there, is there a question? Does anyone have a question?
I do have a question about, somebody has asked about how often the whole process of meeting 504 should be repeated. Every 3 years?
Well, so an IEP would be every 3 years, and the 504 should, okay, I actually have a graph that explains that. So I want to say yes, but hang on. This is where it gets confusing. I have a graph that highlights all of what you get with an IEP and what you get with an 504 that are similar, and then the differences. I'm gonna have to I'm gonna get to that. Sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I wonder if, yeah, as soon as okay, so I'll get to that. Yeah.
And then let me
okay.
ask just one,
Yeah.
another one on the IEPs. The list that you just gave of the conditions, that's for an IEP. Questions are, is that correct? And then the question has, two people have asked about, does ADHD qualify as a disability?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
then it
Sorry, go
does.
ahead. It
And
does.
then
It depends. Look on.
so ADHD, so the question is, does ADHD qualify as a disability? My understanding is that it doesn't qualify for an IEP, but does help you qualify for a 504. Is that correct?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, there are exceptions. I have known kids with ADHD who did qualify for an IEP, but it just really depends. But most of the time, kids with ADHD qualify for a 504 plan. And then I just jumped back to this flow chart here. So it here is a list, identifying. So if the student has one or more of the following types of disabilities: autism, developmental delay, intellectual, sensory, neurological, emotional, communication, so on, and it says yes, then it goes basically to the question, is the student making effective progress in school? And so if the question is yes, then the student is not eligible for special education, but may be eligible for accommodations for disability under Section 504. Whereas if it says, is a student, this is the effective progress I'll get into more in a moment, but and then it says, is a student making effective progress at school? It says, and if it's no, they're not making effective progress, then it goes, is a lack of progress a result of the student's disability? And if it's yes, then it goes, that says, does the student require specially designed instruction in order to make effective progress? And this is where then the student would become eligible for special education. So that's kind of like where it splits. Like, for example, a student with autism, just because you have a diagnosis of autism doesn't mean you automatically qualify for an IEP. The question is the student making effective progress in school? And then, is the lack of progress a result of the student's disability? So that's where it gets, that's why the eligibility determination is so important, and all those assessments and evals and having these meetings, because it feels like a gray area and it's not so clear cut, because it's really a lot of nuance to it.
So if I understand, it's not just these things that would qualify, but you have to have a lack of progress and in your current education plan. And as somebody just asked, is a lack of progress academically only? I guess maybe there's.
That's right. So I have a little video I'm going to play in a moment, which I think explains this, but I'm going to go into effective progress, because that's the key. So here's what effective progress is. I'm just reading it here, defined under 603 CMR or whatever. So the documented growth in the acquisition of knowledge and skills, including social or emotional development, within the general education program, with or without accommodations according to chronological age and developmental expectations and the individual education potential of the child. So it sounds like what does that mean? So it's basically like, is the student accessing their learning, and are they making effective progress? And are they making effective progress? Are they accessing their learning in the general curriculum without any accommodations or specialized learning supports? Are they? Then, and if they aren't, is it because, are they not accessing their learning within the generalized educational curriculum because their disability is interfering with their ability to access their learning, which would then make them qualify for either 504 because they need accommodation in the general ed environment, or they need specialized instruction, and that specialized instruction would in fact be special education, and that would qualify them for an IEP. Does that make sense? So,
Well, it's complicated, obviously. And I
yeah.
think that a lot of people are asking questions about this idea of progress. I'll just read, and maybe you could just generally answer this.
Yeah.
Is effective progress defined as a low bar, no child left behind, C+, or a high bar, success achievement? Many ADHD kids are incredibly bright with high IQ, same with autism spectrum. And then another question is, and how long does the district have to show progress? What if a student does not show progress for 3 years, let's say?
That's a very long time. I mean,
Yeah.
that's where I think if that happened, I mean, I would just say, I mean, that's where, first of all, if a student does have an IEP or a 504, I'm pretty sure this applies to 504 as well, they have to do an eval every 3 years, or re-eval every 3 years, to show if the student's making effective progress. However, before that time, if your student, say, has an IEP, and it's before the 3-year eval, and you want to make changes to the IEP, or anything to that effect, you can do so in writing, as long as the parent approves. And you can also or approves of it, or whatever your request is. Well, if you're the parent, obviously you're approving, but you can also reconvene the team at any time too, to keep reevaluating, is the student making effective progress, and what does that mean for the student? I'm going to play this little video because I feel like this might expand upon that, unless there's any burning question. My cat is scratching at the door, so I have to get up for a minute. Hang on. Let's see.
Children may be diagnosed with a disability by a medical provider. However, being diagnosed with a disability is not a guarantee of services under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, known as IDEA. Having an identified educational disability is the first question when determining if a student qualifies. The evaluation team must also answer 2 additional questions. Does the disability adversely impact the child's educational progress? And does the child need specially designed instruction? Children need to meet IDEA's definition of a child with a disability. There are 14 categories, each with its own criteria. Please see the links below for more details on each of these categories. There's often confusion around dyslexia, ADHD, and autism. Let's discuss these, beginning with dyslexia and ADHD. These are medical conditions diagnosed by a doctor or other expert that often interfere with learning and attention. However, if you look at the list of 14 categories, you will see that they are not listed. So, what are you to do? An educational evaluation is needed to determine if the student meets the criteria for any of the 14 categories. Specific learning disability and other health impairment are the most common categories. So the student is now eligible, right? Not exactly. Remember that disability alone does not determine eligibility for special education services. There are 2 other considerations. Does the disability adversely impact the child's educational progress? And does the child need specially designed instruction? Autism is especially confusing because the same name applies for both a medical diagnosis and one of the 14 categories. Keep in mind that an autism diagnosis does not automatically qualify for special education services. Just like dyslexia and ADHD, an educational evaluation is needed to determine if the student meets the criteria for IDEA's autism category. And once again, those 2 additional requirements must be met. Does the disability adversely impact the child's educational progress, and does the child need specially designed instruction? Don't miss the other videos in this series to continue learning about the principles of IDEA.
Okay, so any questions? Oops, I don't know. Whoops, sorry. I don't know if that helps. I know I'm not answering everyone's questions here, but I don't know if that expands.
Well, I think it's difficult for each individual child, obviously, and it'll be hard for us to help the people here to determine that. Where is this this from, Desiree? Is this in your resources? Because I think this sounded very good, and you could maybe the people here could access this also?
Absolutely. And that's where too that I think it speaks to that how effective progress is not determined solely by passing grades or being promoted from grade to grade. And that's why I think when it's not so clear cut and it's so nuanced depending on the results or the recommendations of the evaluations and assessments that would be yielded or completed within that first 45 days to discuss. So, which I also want to speak to, and I was going to get to more in a bit, but was also to what happens when, you disagree with the school's findings. And there's a lot of recourse for that. So, and before I go on, is there any other questions? Or did I cover everything?
No, I'll let you go on because I know that there are things that people are waiting for the end about what accommodations are. So
okay,
yeah,
great.
go ahead.
So I have to get reoriented to where I was. I think okay. Sorry. I know someone had a question about No Child Left Behind, so I didn't get to that. But, okay. Skipping ahead here to, sorry, we did that. Okay, and then this just goes into fundings and costs, and this is actually highlighting the difference between a 504 and an IEP. But students receive these services at no charge, and states receive additional funding for students with IEPs. And whereas funding for 504, students receive these services at no charge, and states do not receive extra funding for students with 504 plans, but the federal government can take funding away from programs, including schools, that don't meet their legal duty to serve kids with disabilities, and IDEA funds can't be used to serve students with 504 plans.
Desiree, I think we
Yeah.
aren't accessing your slides yet.
Oh,
We're
you're
still,
not?
yeah. I mean, I think you have to exit that.
Oh, exit.
I
Oh,
don't see your slides right now.
Oh,
Right,
okay.
you were.
I think I was looking at the wrong laptop. Sorry. Okay, sorry. Okay, going back. So do you see this page? It says
I
funding
still
costs.
see the YouTube clip.
Oh, that's odd. Oh dear. I don't know what to do. No. Okay, so you can't
If
see.
you share screen again, maybe it's a different.
Okay.
If you hit share screen and then go to a different window.
Is that working?
We're still on the. There you go. Good.
Okay.
Good.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So here, okay, so I was just talking about funding costs, but then I just am skipping ahead. So the special education says the student requires specialized instruction to make effective progress. So this goes a little more into this topic. So the special education teacher modifies the content, methodology, and performance criteria as appropriate to address to address the unique needs of the child and ensure access to the general education curriculum. Okay, so let me just keep moving along there, hoping this will. Oops. And then, does the student require related support or services to access the curriculum? So I think this is where it starts to get broken down while you're in that process to determine, is the child accessing their learning? Is the child making effective progress? Because there's all these kind of categories and things you go through. So does a student require related supports or services to access the curriculum? And so here's a list like, assistive tech, audiology, occupational therapy, orientation and mobility, psych or neuropsych testing, physical therapy, paraeducator training, rehab counseling, parent training, so on. I put paraeducator training because a lot of times if your student has a para and let's say your kiddo is using sign language and your paraeducator doesn't know sign language, the school needs to pay for the para to get trained in sign language. Does the student require related supports or services to access the curriculum? So this kind of keeps going into the eligibility determination process. So recreation, school nurse, social worker, health services, speech, travel training, that's for transition age, transportation, training, or needing specialized transportation. And then I'm going to stop there for a sec with any questions.
I think still most of the questions are around what are the accommodations and things for specific things. There are a couple others, but I'll let you go ahead. I think you go ahead.
Okay. Then, so this one, let's see here. So related support services to access the curriculum in Massachusetts, a student can qualify an IEP if they need specialized instruction or in related services to access the general curriculum. So, okay, but I don't, so anyway, but is the team, so what is the team decision? Is that this, okay, so here, this is what I wanted to get. So if the school's like, oh yeah, we, no, the team's determining your kid's not eligible. So when that happens, the team would notify the parents in writing of determination of ineligibility with the N2 form, and that has to be within 10 school days of the team meeting. This is where the documentation stuff is so important. So also documenting all your communication back and forth with the school. And the student may not be eligible for special education, but may be eligible for other services and other programs like a 504 plan. And if a parent disagrees with an initial evaluation, the parent may request an independent educational evaluation, which I'll get into a little more detail. There's a few, like as we go along here, but there's a few different ways to go about that. Sometimes you could get one out of pocket, or if there's a degree to which that's not possible, then there's a certain amount of days that would pass that would make a family eligible to be able to get an independent educational evaluation or outside evaluations, which are really important. And then there's the other piece here. Parents have a right to speak to the Bureau of Special Education Appeals if you're in this process and you're disagreeing with the school, and say you get an independent eval and you're still like not agreeing in the school, and you are just not agreeing. There are other resources out there to contact in the state for support in navigating this and making sure that the school's in compliance. Not eligible for an IEP, may be eligible for a 504, and if a student does not require specialized instruction, like I was saying, to access the curriculum, but does require accommodations to access school, the student may be eligible for accommodations under Section 504. And so that's where, again, kind of going over that process, this would all be determined in the eligibility determination process in terms of what level of accommodation a student needed. And then required for 504 plan and IEP. So these are similarities between a 504 and an IEP. They both are required to provide a free and appropriate public education under the most least restrictive environment. There's the disability determination process that we discussed at the beginning here, with that kind of determining eligibility. Both tracks would get evaluations, accommodations based on need, accommodations on testing like MCAS type stuff. And then also both tracks can submit appeals to the Bureau of Special Education Appeals, the Problem Resolution Systems, or the Office for Civil Rights. And then the next slide kind of draws more of a distinction, not required for a 504 plan. So if you have a 504, like an IEP, you would get a written plan. A 504 plan, not required. The school's not required to provide a written plan. The school's not required to provide progress reports or annual team meetings. And then discipline protections limited, meaning like if a kiddo's on an IEP and they have behavioral issues, you cannot suspend them, or they have discipline protection. So they would say, oh, kiddo's having a hard time, let's write a functional behavior assessment. Whereas students with a 504, they're not protected against suspension. And then also with 504 plans, there's no transition planning. So those are some of the important differences. And I don't know if that helps to answer some of the other questions people had. And then the next piece here, sorry. So the team will then develop an IEP, determine placement, hold an annual review of the IEP and placement, and then reevaluate for eligibility every 3 years. And I believe that's the same for the 504 as well. I mean, the reevaluation every 3 years. The purpose of an IEP is to follow the Massachusetts curriculum frameworks, local school district curriculum, and also to make sure students have accommodations with the MCAS and all these other types of tests to take. And also the content of the IEP includes a variety of things, as you can see listed here, including parents and or student concerns, related services, present level of performance, service delivery grid, which is super important, placement, determination, etc. And then, and in terms of accommodation, these are examples of accommodations: extended testing time, preferred seating, audiobooks and recorded lectures, computers and computer-assisted technology, use of a graphic organizer, reading and writing software, sensory breaks, large print materials, etc.
Well, we're talking about what accommodations are. I think that addresses one. Somebody asked about ADHD. I think that's one of the most common ones that I talk to people about. Can you go back to that accommodation? So somebody asked about what would the accommodations for ADHD. So this is that slide that we're talking about, which talks about specific things that a child with ADHD might benefit from. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And then some. So because a neuropsych test or a psych eval is going to expand upon for that unique, tailored, the learning style for that student with ADHD, right? Because not all students with ADHD are the same, but they or have the same needs, but all share kind of like similar types of needs and for accommodation. This, I think, is a good kind of general like idea for sure.
And somebody asked, how does a school respond to anxiety that's impacting written output? They want what kind of accommodations might be made for that?
Well, I think if, again, that would be another case, right, where if anxiety was interfering with a student accessing their learning, right? If they're not, if it's impacting their ability to do written output, then that would be them accessing it's interfering with them accessing the curriculum. So in terms of accommodation, I mean, that would again have to be determined by you'd go through an eligibility determination process and further assessment for the school, looking at that unique student and their unique needs and learning style, and figure out how to best accommodate that student so that the anxiety is not interfering with their ability to access the curriculum, in this case with writing output. And that could look like, I don't know, like it could be like maybe specialized tutoring, or more access to the adjustment counselor. I mean, I don't have the total answer for that, but I do know like the procedures to try and go about getting a more distilled answer from the district, because it's also too depends on what services and supports they can provide accommodation wise, and if they can, again, you'd have to outsource kind of thing with whatever that is. So any other questions?
I'm thinking out loud, I don't know myself,
Right.
but could it be like even a scribe who, if the anxiety is about writing as opposed to could that be an accommodation, some things along those lines?
Or maybe like Kurzweil or something. I don't know. I mean, that's where I think having like sometimes like talking to an assistive technology person can be helpful, but that's where it varies. And that's the kind of answer I think that's kind of hard for me to answer, because it's like a specialized person, I think, who was like a writing writing person. But I do know, for example, like Kurzweil, or these sort of like if actual writing, it depends, right? If the student's like actual keyboarding is just, is it the way that they're trying to write, is that what it is, or is it like just the anxiety and it doesn't matter what accommodation? You could like, here's this, speak into this microphone and it will dictate your notes for you, or here's this other type of thing or whatever. Then if it's kind of really really the anxiety component. The school can provide accommodation, but I think that would be more on the mental health front, like about providing maybe supports or services within the school itself to help the student with their anxiety related symptoms. It gets kind of like a little, you know, so I don't know if that makes sense. I don't have the answer, but I'm just speculating. So then I was talking about the standard for providing services, free appropriate public education, right? Free at no cost, doesn't cost anything, it's free. All the services that are appropriate, public education, least restrictive environment, the standards of determining the placement. Sorry, so these are, I guess what I'm trying to say here though, this is the standard for providing services. And then the least restrictive environment is then there's the standards of determining the placement. This means the student is placed to the maximum extent appropriate with students who are not disabled. So like we don't want students to be completely segregated and excluded because, you know, they're using a wheelchair, like something like in olden times, or not so olden times, like maybe the 70s, or maybe that's still happening in a lot of places. But to be, you know, for students to be included to the extent it's appropriate, you know, with students who are not disabled with use of supports as needed, and the team decides which placement is the least restrictive environment for the student. Possible placements. So there's a whole other conversation. There's a variety of different types of placements, whether that's full inclusion at 80% or partial inclusion at 60%, substantially separate day school, residential school, and so on. And this is all stuff that would be, you know, in a proposed IEP. And then at the close of the meeting, parents receive a summary of the decisions and agreements made at the actual meeting. Like often you'll get like a written document, and it should include, it's not legally binding though, because you're not signing anything at a meeting. Like you're not required to sign anything at the end of an IEP or 504 meeting. You're just there, you're taking in the data, and then they'll give you, if it's an IEP, for example, a proposed plan. Basically, there's just like, here's the details and the notes. This is not even a drafted IEP or 504 plan, but here's the detail for today. Statement of the major goals associated with those services, and then the parents take that away, and the expected proposed IEP or 504 plan should come in 2 calendar weeks from the day. Calendar weeks? Yeah, 2 calendar weeks from the day of the meeting. And then here are your options when you get the IEP, and this applies to 504 as well. You accept it in full, in part, or you just reject the whole thing. And then options for placement, as I had listed before, the different types of placements, you either accept it or reject the placement. So let's say the school's like, yeah, we want your kid to be 60% included. And you're like, no, I want my kid to be 80% included. And then you just, I reject it. And then there's next steps there. So, sorry. So let's say, so then you have 30 calendar days that parents can request a team meeting to discuss rejected portions of the IEP, or basically just to respond. So you have 30 kilos if you accept it and you're like, yeah, I love this IEP, let's go with that. Then you accept it, and then and then you move forward, and then it will be implemented as soon as they receive that acceptance. If you reject it, then you can request a team meeting to discuss the rejected portions of the IEP. Meanwhile, there's stay put rights, which means that your previously accepted services or placements will not be interrupted or stopped or anything until these matters get resolved around the new proposed IEP. And then also do more research, you can observe the school placement. So that's like parents and their experts have an unconditional right to observe students current in any proposed placement. So if they're like, we propose your kiddo go to a day program down the street or something, you have the right to go there and observe it and see if you feel like that's appropriate placement for your kid. Parents have the right to request and receive a copy of school records. And then also you have the right to consult an independent expert And also, you know, if you consult an independent expert or you get an outside eval, the team must reconvene in 10 school days to discuss reports that you submit to the school. And then when an IEP is accepted, parents, you know, sign and return to the IEP, and the school will implement all the parts immediately. And then you should expect a progress report as often as report cards for an IEP, not a 504. And then an annual team meeting review for an IEP, not a 504, and a 3-year eval or sooner if needed. And I believe that also applies to a 504. And then changing the IEP after the meeting. After the annual IEP meeting, parents in the school may agree in writing to update or change the IEP with another team meeting. Yeah. So I like to tell people, you can, you know, anytime you like, before the annual meeting, you could change the IEP and have that correspondence, or you could call an IEB reconvene. Transition planning by age 14, which is a whole other topic, but that's just important to know. And that would be initiated with a transition planning form as an upstart to draft the IEP.
Desiree, I want to be mindful of time because we have 5 more minutes, and there are about 4 more questions that I haven't asked you yet. But
okay,
what is there something else that you think? I want to ask you about a couple of individual things and about advocates. But before we do that, is there something else that you think is important to say for a few minutes? And maybe we'll just go a few more minutes after 5:30 to answer individual questions, because I do want to get to those.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to go. So this is important, but I'm not going to go into it too much right now because I mentioned it before. I just want to touch on this real quick. So if, you know, all else fails and you've tried everything and you've had an advocate and you're not getting anywhere, there's procedural safeguards and due process rights. So these are just this information and phone numbers for the Office for Civil Rights. Their phone number is part of procedural safeguard and due process rights. So this is if like you're all in disagreement, you can't agree, you've tried everything and so on, but that's more in violation of a civil right within the school. The other one is procedural violations and enforcement issues, or the problem resolution system. So if you're feeling like your school is out of compliance with special education, state and federal law, you can call these folks and hopefully they will be helpful to you. And then the other one is you could also call this other resource. Oh, sorry, I'm using the computer. This other resource, facilitated IEP meetings, you can call to help for them, like an outside source to facilitate a meeting to make sure the school's in compliance. And this is like a mediation number or support if you're needing help with mediation. And then of course, if like all else fails and you're like, we need a Bureau of Special Education Appeals hearing, this is who you call. I could send this information along. Yeah. So anyway, so I could do those questions and then I could maybe email the tips and tricks to everyone.
Fantastic. So somebody asked about advocates. Maybe everybody doesn't know what an advocate is, how you get an advocate, and what does an advocate do.
Okay, is that the question?
I think so. We would love recommendations, specific advocates. No, that's resources. Sorry.
Okay.
When is it helpful to hire and work with an educational advocate? That was the question.
So I think that if you're kind of like I was, especially when, let's say you do an evaluation and you don't like the results and the school saying, we don't think your kid's eligible, or let's say you have an IEP or 504 and the school feels really like they're really out of compliance and you've tried a lot, or you just need help navigating the process, you know, having an ed consultant or an ed advocate can be really helpful at a lot of points. But I think especially if you're starting to feel a lot of stress and you're like, like we're not getting anywhere, it feels like I have to babysit the school and make sure they follow the IEP. And, you know, I think that, or if you feel like your kid's not making effective progress and you and the school are seeing very differently, and it's at a point of feeling like there's a lot of some tension, or you're just wanting more guidance or support, I think that's a point where it's good to have an ed consultant. But you can always contact one beforehand just to consult with at the beginning of the process, you know, if you have the means, or if you find one for free from the Federation for Children with Special Needs, just to help guide you through the process, because it's really complicated and confusing, and it's a huge learning curve for parents. So you can just talk to someone, but you don't necessarily have to have them come to meetings with you. And you don't have to let the school know you're talking to one. It's just your own personal business. So
another question about evaluations. We had an evaluation done for our child. The recommendations were the child is eligible for 504 or IEP, especially in math. Is the school obligated to accept the evaluation? I think this is a common question.
Was it, so did you have it, did they have an outside eval first before approaching the school for an evaluation?
Corey, do you want to unmute yourself and you can ask that?
Yes, we did.
Okay, so you had, so, all right, so yes, so you got the eval before you contacted the school. So that's a little tricky. And did you approach the school with the eval and they said no, or?
No, we didn't want to put her through all that, considering everybody was out of school for a good long time with the virus, and we just thought that was a perfect time to do it, because she had been having problems with the math, and so we had a evaluation done, psychiatric evaluation and a education one done. And we just didn't want her to go into middle school, because it was her first year going into middle school,
right,
being taken out of classes to have it done. And there was an issue where she had a few concussions. So we also wanted to rule out that her learning ability had anything to do with the concussions.
Okay. Well, I mean, if anything, from my perspective, you save the school some time and money, if anything.
Right.
I mean, I think it would be, if, approaching the school and just saying, hey, we had these evals done, and if it was also recommended within the evals you had for the IEP or 504, that could be basically, I mean, it doesn't have to come from the eval, but you can just use that to say, it could come from you, or you can say, hey, it's been recommended, this kid, our child's been referred for more of an assessment and evaluation for an IEP. And then you would just bring that, you would start that process with the school if you would like to, based on the recommendation from the outside eval. And then you would give that information to the school, and it would, if nothing else, just be helpful to help guide their process, and with that information that's already been done. Does that make sense?
It does, to a point. I guess we were just wondering, so would they be doing extra testing themselves, or would they just have to accept what we had done and work it into a program?
I think you would have to talk to them, because if the data and information you have, and if they have their, people on staff who look it over and feel like, oh yeah, this is sufficient, because a lot of times I don't feel like schools want to replicate stuff if they don't always have to, because it's like kind of the horse before the cart. Usually people are the other way around, and that's where it can become a little contentious. But you're kind of going and being like, here's this information. They may or may not do more testing, depending on if there are certain areas that weren't covered. So it's kind of up to the school to decide if they want to just use that information or not.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We have, if people, there are just maybe a few more minutes that we have. Somebody asked questions about ADHD testing and about Vanderbilt scores. I think I can actually answer that one, if that's all right.
Yeah.
We had all the providers at Northampton Area Pediatrics are skilled and have experience in diagnosing ADHD. ADHD is a diagnosis that's made on many different ways, and it's not just a specific test. It's actually, you have to take a good history, and then you do testing to confirm that, and then you can make a diagnosis. But there are tests that we use Vanderbilt's happen to be ones that we use here, but there are many other ones, Connors and many other validated instruments that can be helpful in diagnosing ADHD. And a neuropsychologist, there are several different ones that I'm not even familiar with all the different names. So yes, a neuropsychologist might do several other tests, instruments as well. But for just a diagnosis of ADHD, that's something that we can do at NAP. If there are concerns about comorbidities, meaning other things such as could learning disabilities be influencing the ADHD symptoms, anxiety, or other ways in which the brain might not be processing correctly, that's when we might recommend neuropsychological testing, where they'll do many different types of testing. Resources. Somebody asked about the resources. Do you want to about other ways of getting information for parents who are looking for that? I think you had that on your slide.
Yeah, I do. Hang on. Okay. Thanks so much. Yeah, so I have a resource list here. I could maybe just send this. I don't have everyone's contact info. I don't know what would be the best way, if people want to screenshot this maybe. And then, or I could, yeah, but that's the
We're going to post this. We'll post
great.
this recording on our website.
Okay.
And so yeah, you maybe just taking a screenshot or a picture of this would be great, but you will be able to refer back to this.
Okay.
Somebody's asked about what is an IEE.
Oh, you mean in the independent educational evaluation? Sorry, this is closing here. Yeah, so I was gonna go into that before, and then I kind of skipped. But basically, independent education evaluation is, let's say you have, you know, all the findings from the evaluation that the school district did, and you're not in agreement with their findings, and you want to get your own outside independent educational evaluation. You can do that. It's easier said than done, but you can do that, you know, within the realm of contacting, you know, people and pay out of pocket or with insurance. But also the school district, there is a degree to which too, I think it's like after a certain amount of time passes, I was reading it, I have a slide for it, but that you can have the school district pay for an independent educational evaluation if you're in disagreement with the findings, and then also if your family qualifies for certain, you know, income variables, and that would qualify so that the school district would have to pay for it. And that's where getting sometimes an advocate to talk to about this would be helpful, because you know the school has to be in agreement with you that an independent evaluation is needed. So that's where it could get a little tricky. So like a lot of times people will get like I know myself, like I've gone out and got like a neuropsych eval for my son from like Boston Children's because I wasn't happy with the school's findings, and then I'd bring back the neuropsych assessment and evaluation, and then they'd have to have a proper meeting with me and have one of their professionals disseminate the findings, and then we have to look at that and consider it to inform the IEP. But anyway.
The last question, I guess, is if the school says child does not qualify for IEP, is there a deadline to ask for 504 after the IEP meeting?
So if the school says your kid does not qualify for an IEP, and they said they didn't.
Is there a deadline to ask for 504?
You should be able to just ask for it at the meeting, and then they need to justify and explain why. Like that, like based on that, there was that one PDF, and that's on the resource list of the parents guide, and it explains. So like, let's say if it's determined that the student is making effective progress despite their disability in certain areas, but then they may qualify for a 504 instead. And there's not a deadline. I would just say at the day of the meeting, just saying, helping to clarify. Are they also saying yes, and we feel like they do not also qualify for a 504, and just, you know, have them explain why. And then if you walk away from the meeting and you're really feeling unhappy about that, there's a lot you could do recourse wise. So you know, there's no deadline. It's just more that you would have to just kind of collect data and come up, you know, with a plan of how you want to readdress that issue. And that could be involved consulting other experts or getting an ed advocate or getting further outside evaluation yourself.
There's some more questions about insurance. I'm sorry, Ben. I think we're going to have to finish up here. Curious if some insurances are better in general specifics. About insurance companies covering, I think, for this kind of testing. I know that from my standpoint, it's been very difficult to do that. So I don't know if, Desiree, you have any other comments on insurance companies covering for these kinds of evaluations?
Usually you could get an insurance company to cover a neuropsych eval or an occupational therapy assessment or eval or speech therapy eval. It's just really a matter of finding a place that doesn't have, like, you know, wait list that's 12 years long. And because, like, for example, like Boston Children's, they have all these departments. You could go there and get these evals, and usually insurance will cover them, like at least a neuropsych or speech therapy eval or an occupational therapy eval. And I think you can only get like one a year or something like that with insurance, but usually you could get it. It's just about finding a place, unless you're talking about other types of evals that are kind of not.
Well, I think it's a good question. It's open enrollment time. So if you can go to one carrier over another, I think you might want to be able to look at the fine print of your different options and see if they do that. Because I do know that some insurance companies do have, will give you a very hard time.
Yeah.
Well, I think that, Desiree, I want to thank you so much for helping us kind of navigate this complicated area. I mean, you synthesized at least 5 or 6 hours into 1.5. And what I'd like to even propose, if people are interested, I'd like to get some feedback, even if you can do it in the chat, because I think we've tried to. This is the first time we've done this workshop, and it was fantastic with all the information. I'd like to maybe see if we might in the future break it down into 2 different ones, maybe, and even I'm wondering, and I'm thinking out loud here, if people would be interested if we had a kind of an open forum with you to just say, okay, you could kind of, I don't know, kind of give ideas on individual people. I'm offering you to do that, Desiree, without asking you beforehand. But could people, is that of help? And just give me an idea in the chat or email me, talking to the participants, on how you think we might be able to help you with your kids who might have special learning needs, get the kind of educational opportunities that they deserve. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you very much, Desiree, for helping us through this.
You're welcome. Thanks everyone for coming.
Desiree?
Yes.
Are you in tomorrow? Because I'll follow up on what people have said. Does that sound good?